I'm Brian Latimer. We have a really cool segment planned out for you guys today. If you fish on a fishery that has aquatic vegetation, this is a segment that you definitely want to pay close attention to. We're going to talk to Dr. Brett Hartis today. Brett oversees all the aquatic vegetation management over the whole Tennessee Valley Authority, which includes over 40 fisheries. And Brett's going to dispel a lot of the rumors and misconceptions about what they actually do to make those fisheries accessible for us as fishermen and how they actually help us so we can maintain the fisheries and catch a lot of big fish out there. Brett, I appreciate you tuning in with us today.
Absolutely, Brian. I appreciate you giving me a call on this. This is probably some of my most common questions I get, and we try to do our best to reach out to anglers and get any opportunity we can to talk a little bit about our program. Just real quick to give you some background, most of your listeners are probably familiar with, our big 4 or 5 reservoirs from a fisheries perspective. Gunnersville, of course. Guys are probably fishing some of those big reservoirs, but we've actually got 49 reservoirs in our system in total, and I oversee all the aquatic plant management activities that go on at those reservoirs. So probably one of the biggest questions I get is, how much vegetation do you guys manage? Is this an eradication type program? Is TVA out there trying to get rid of all the grass? The answer to that, I don't even like to use the word eradication because our program is absolutely not geared toward getting rid of vegetation. We definitely realize the benefits.
That's not even possible. I don't think it's not even possible.
No, it's not. That's the craziest thing. We get a lot more credit than we're due for sure. But one of the interesting things about how TVA manages aquatic plants is compared to, other areas where there are basically, we'll call them eradication programs, but they're minimization programs. They're trying to reduce all vegetation, especially invasives in a lot of other places across the nation. But TVA, we go at it a little bit differently, mainly because we are a public entity. And we're basically looking out for the benefit of all of our stakeholders, the best way that we can balance all that, whether you're a bass fisherman, duck hunter, homeowner, pleasure boater, you name it. And really the best way that we can see to do that is to manage and develop public access areas. And what I mean by that, we're talking about the very same boat ramps that the anglers are using to get in and out of the water. So, unfortunately, hydrilla and milfoil are great to fish during certain times of the year, but they can also keep you from getting your boat into the reservoir. So
in and out, exactly.
Yeah, that's kind of where our program comes into play.
You talked about, you hit on one thing that's really prevalent that I'd like, this especially for fishermen that we're really interested in. You mentioned invasive species. Can you talk a little bit about the native species of aquatic vegetation we have, what's invasive, and how and why do we need to control the invasive species? What's the balance that you guys try to get between invasive species and what's native to the area?
Absolutely. So one of the big things here that we've got to realize, especially in the southeast where most of your listeners probably spend a lot of their time, we don't have natural lakes. They're reservoirs. They're man-made. So the native plants to a reservoir used to be oaks and pine trees before the area was flooded. Those areas that hold the hydrillas and the milfoils now, we used to not even be inundated with water. So, even a lot of our natives, which might be native to the region, can get really aggressive. I know a lot of guys have asked about eelgrass on Gunnersville. It's been a learning curve for a lot of guys I know to learn to fish eelgrass. And eelgrass is native. Oh yeah, I love it, but you just got to learn how to change it up a little bit. You can't rip a rattle trap through it in the early season like you can hydrilla. You just kind of have to adjust to it. So, long story short, eelgrass or tape grass is a native species to the region, but it gets really aggressive in our reservoirs because reservoirs aren't natural water bodies, and they've got a lot of nutrients and things like that, which can drive these plants to really take off.
Gotcha.
But, again, we try to preserve that aspect of the good side of that by only managing those select areas. Just to give folks an idea out there, Chickamauga Reservoir is a really good example. 30-plus thousand acre reservoir, and this year we've only managed 20 acres on the whole lake. and most of those are half-acre blocks for boat ramps and state parks and places like that, swim beaches, that kind of stuff. So that's probably the first huge misconception. They think just because they see an airboat going up and down the reservoir that they're treating the whole reservoir.
Absolutely. A lot of that I would imagine is you guys going out and scouting and seeing what areas need to be treated even when you're out there. So it's almost like you're guilty by association even by being out in the field seeing what needs to be treated, I assume.
Yeah, unfortunately, airboats are probably the least conspicuous vehicles to be riding around on a reservoir. But guys that fish it all the time, especially local guys that are there in the September and October time frame when all this vegetation is topped out, they realize why we have to have these boats. We go into really, really shallow water. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the scouting aspect of all this. Basically, when we go out and treat weeds, there's not some cure-all. There's not one product that works for everything.
Absolutely.
Gunnersville, for example, has got 40 plus or minus species of submerged plants like your hydrillas and milfoils, and there's only about 13 products or 13 active ingredients that you can use in aquatics to manage these plants. That's in comparison to, say, 400 or 500 active ingredients that are used on your food and water that you eat and drink every day. So we have to go out. We go out and pre-monitor a site and look and see not only what's there and what products we would have to use, but if it even warrants treatment at all. We're not going out and putting anything in the water ahead of time. There's no pre-emergent.
No pre-emergent.
There's no pre-emergent. And the reason for that is these herbicides rely on the plant actively growing. So if they're not there, there's nothing. My favorite, I'll call it a tall tale among my angling buddies, is the 20-year pellet or the stuff that goes out that you put in the soil that keeps it from coming back. It's just there's nothing out there that works.
Right, exactly. It's only post-emergent. It only works, I assume, if it touches plant parts is the only way you can use it. Right. This is a subject that is pretty dear to my heart because I come from a landscaping background and a good bit of background in herbicides and pesticides and so forth. So it's very disturbing to me as well when I hear people say, they sprayed all the grass out. And it's just totally impossible. If they really understood the seed to life cycle and how difficult that actually is through, imagine all the coots that poop out all the seeds and everything. There's no way you could ever eradicate all the plant life in a fishery. But that leads into another good point is a lot of times you'll see, for instance, I noticed in Lake Gunnersville, the eelgrass is very prevalent right now. That's one thing, that everybody talks about. And in my mind, it has to be environmental factors are the biggest factor in what vegetation thrives and when it's on a decline, I assume. Is that correct?
You hit the nail on the head, and we are seeing that. We're seeing a great example of that this year in the Tennessee Valley in general. So basically, I've gotten a lot of calls this year from Chickamauga and places like that where, man, the hydrilla is just not there like it was. Or Pickwick. Pickwick's a great example. There's whole areas that are just devoid of hydrilla this year. And guys, some guys are like, what happened? It's almost like aliens came down and took it off with them this spring before it ever came up. And what we had this year as compared to the last 3 years, so the big things that play a big role with what these plants do, first off, is what kind of winter did we have? If that winter is really cold and long, just like your yard plants, they're not going to get started as early. And in the case of this year, hydrilla it was about a month and a half to 2 months behind, which means it's going to take it much longer to get to the top. And sometimes, right around mid-August, we start to see the days shorten. And basically the plants are going to reverse their life cycle, and they're going to be putting all their energy into making seed and different survival structures to make sure they come back next year. So some of these places guys saw hydrilla last year topped out and just thriving, never made it this year.
Never made it. It had a lot of high water as well, right?
Oh, man, so I'm glad you mentioned that. That's number 2 on the list here. So these plants are in a real critical life stage in really late spring. That's when you see the hydrillas and even a lot of our
Yeah.
native pond weeds and things like that, just starting to pop their head up.
Exactly.
So
That's the biggest
one of the things
factor.
a lot of guys don't realize is that even a 4 to 5 mile an hour flow during a good flood event on the Tennessee River, that's the equivalent of a 2 to 250 mile an hour wind.
Right.
So it's kind of like a tornado going through the system. That's a lot of force to move sediment around.
Right. Water level is a huge deal. It's a huge deal in controlling aquatic vegetation. That's one reason we don't have it in South Carolina where I'm native, because we draw down the lakes a lot. Exactly. All right. That's awesome. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is probably the biggest determining factor in whether grass is growing or whether it's not is the environmental factors, water level, the temperature, the spring. You know, a lot of times you never know what you're going to get in the South with your springtime. It can be hot, cold, and different, and that flow really can disturb a lot of the fisheries and affect the aquatic vegetation growth. So that's great that you mentioned that.
If you would have asked me in January what kind of year we were going to have, I would have said it would have been the most weedy year we've ever had. And then the rain started. Right.
It was in mid-April or around April we started getting a lot of rain. Yep.
We're not out there just trying to be mean and get rid of all the weeds. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us just to do that out of meanness. That's one thing I always tell guys is I'm not, some guy sitting at home plotting how I'm going to make fishing hard for guys the next year.
And I think, especially on the Tennessee River Valley, those communities and towns, they really rely on the income and the economics of fishing. They need the fishery to be good. They don't want fishing to be bad. They don't want the grass to die. They want it to thrive and be good, because fishing brings so much money to those small towns. You think about a town like the small town of Guntersville, which is one I'm just very familiar with. Without that lake, Guntersville is not, it almost doesn't exist. That brings a lot, all the hotels, there would be no reason to have a hotel in Guntersville if it wasn't for the fishing there and all the guides and everything. So the economics just doesn't make sense for government authorities to go and eradicate all the aquatic vegetation, which makes the fishing good. So that's just a huge misconception out there.
That's one of TVA's primary goals, alongside environment and energy, is economic development. And just like you said, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. I always use this term. It's disparity breeds prosperity, and in the case of even invasive species in the Tennessee Valley, when everyone realized, hey, we can't beat this. I will say there was a time back in the 60s and 70s. That's the last time TVA even considered the word eradication. When we first got milfoil, Eurasian water milfoil, we tried. And it just didn't work, and we learned to live with it, and so did the people of the valley. And quickly, just like you said, the Guntersville started popping up. Now the Dayton's, Dayton is becoming a prime time place, kind of like Guntersville. It's a destination to go bass fishing. And a lot of that has to do with the way the vegetation that's there, and more importantly, how we manage that vegetation. A lot of programs. I've done this in the Roanoke chain in North Carolina and worked some in South Carolina at one time, and I've been part of programs that are more aggressive, and that makes sense for those programs. But once you have such a historical aquatic plant issue that like I said, once we realized it's not possible to get rid of these plants, like I said, we learned to live with it, and we manage. We're doing our best trying to get out and help guys to understand this stuff, and really, I'm a fisherman first. That's what got me into this line of work. I was a fish squeezer, fish head, and did my bachelor's degree in fisheries work, and slowly and surely worked my way into a master's and PhD dealing with aquatic plants and crop science. I wanted to understand this side a little bit more, and I had reservations about the same type of things that these guys did. I'd heard different stories, and it led me kind of into this path, and honestly, knowing what I know now has helped me in some respects to be a better fisher. One other thing I did want to touch on when we talk about let me backpedal a little bit. And I think I mentioned we did 20 acres on Chickamauga this year in total out of the 30,000 acre lake. Well, those treatments aren't permanent treatments. That's the other thing that a lot of guys don't realize. This isn't a one and done. It's more like mowing the grass in the summertime. And that's our program runs typically from about the 1st of June until about mid-September. And that's really during the peak use times when everybody's out and trying to be on the lake. So
Right.
once we stop in September, we just wrapped up here recently in the first part of September. If the growing season is still going on, a lot of times these plants grow right back
Right.
where we
Well,
left
and
them.
let me back up a little bit to what we were talking about just a little earlier. What chemicals do you guys typically use and the frequency that you use? If I'm not mistaken, it's a lot of the chemicals that we use in our home lawns. So they're plenty safe for, it's not something, we're not going out spraying something that we would in the 60s or anything. Plenty safe chemicals, and the frequency is not even that great.
Right, absolutely. So you mentioned a lot of these products have the same active ingredient as stuff. You've heard the term like diquat or copper-based herbicides or 2,4-D or a lot of different a lot of different products like that. Well, the key here though is that it's aquatic labeled herbicides. Those labels, basically the formulation of those products, has no impact on aquatic-based organisms. And one of the big things here to try to remember, I mentioned there's 13 active ingredients that are registered for aquatics. And it takes about 10 to 15 years, that registration process, 10 to 15 years, and I think around $1 billion for these companies to ever get this through testing with EPA.
Right.
So it's not somebody found a chemical that, killed some milfoil and hey, let's go try it. It takes a really long time for this stuff to ever be approved and registered for use. Now, the 13 that I mentioned, a lot of them work really well in ponds and places without a lot of water exchange. Most of our reservoirs, a lot of guys don't realize this, but they turn over anywhere from every 8 to 13 days. We get a whole new batch of water. So roughly half of those 13 will not work in reservoirs because the water changeover is too fast. It's kind of like,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's kind of like putting a drop of food coloring in the side of your bathtub after you filled it up and then cutting the faucet back on and opening the drain. You can't keep that concentration that you need to impact those plants in one spot. So we have to rely on what are called contact herbicides for most of our work because of water exchange and because, again, we're only trying to manage right there around the site. So we're not trying to do like a whole embayment treatment or even a whole cove treatment. We're just trying to affect a half acre right there so you can get your boat out. And a lot of people have seen our big harvesters out on the water. So beyond that, we use harvesters to cut lanes in. So, in these areas like Seabold on Gunnersville or up in Mud Creek and places like that, we may cut over a mile of a lane just to get you out to the main river.
Choke it out and there's no access. You're actually working for the anglers in this particular instance.
And what a lot of these guys, I've got a lot of buddies down here that, I've met since I've been in Gunnersville, and we get to talking. A lot of them, some of these guys avoid the treatment areas like it turns into a dead zone. And what they don't realize is, like I said, it's kind of like mowing the grass. So when everything else is topped out, especially in the hydrilla mats where there's basically not a whole lot of room for a bass to make a living, in the areas that we treat, it's kind of like somebody mowing a lane through there or cutting a lane through there, and the vegetation immediately starts growing again. That growth pattern can actually produce an oxygen-rich environment from all that growth that's going on. And, man, you want to talk about some bass superhighways. I've seen them pushing shad all over the place behind these big walls where we treat. And a lot of guys have taken notice of that. And I've actually seen them watching for our signs that we put up and looking at our treatment schedule to say, hey, I'm going to go fish that next week after they get done with it.
I tell you, I'm definitely going to put that tip in my hat for sure, because I know a lot of what we hear about aquatic vegetation is strictly myth among anglers. I mean, and but that was one that I definitely did have some trepidation about. Is after the area is sprayed, even myself, I thought, maybe that's an area you probably need to not be around. So that makes perfect sense though, because even probably some of that dead and decaying stuff is probably attracting bait fish and shad and so forth, because all the algae is putting off. Plus the new that's coming out is really oxygenated areas. So that's a good point to bring up.
It's kind of like being a deer hunter and mowing yourself some lanes through a cutover.
Right, exactly.
Those deer are looking for that fresh vegetation to feed on, and just like you said, the invertebrates and things like that start to move in after the fact, and that just runs the food chain wide open.
Right, right. That's a really great tip. So, well, that's an awesome conversation. I'm glad we got to talk about that. Is there anything that fishermen can do to help our fisheries be more healthy? Is there anything that we play a role that we don't do that possibly we should be doing to help you guys out and not where we're fighting one another?
I know that everybody has probably heard it to death at this point. Clean, drain, dry. You know, we talked about how we manage invasives, and invasives do have, in some cases, some benefits where they provide some habitat, but not any better than some of the native species that we do have. Really, you know, once an invasive is established for several years, I'm talking 10 years or so, that's when it becomes an issue where there's no getting rid of it. You got to learn to live with it. And you can be proactive and push for native revegetation of lakes and get the same benefits without the same motor clogging mess at the boat ramp with some of these native species. So really having a look at what types of plants you're dealing with plays a big role. And I'm going to make a really quick plug. We actually have a website out there specifically for anglers to learn the different species, and this is a lot different than your average weed ID guide like everybody's seen that describes in all these technical terms. This is solely for anglers. This is to tell you when it typically comes up, how to fish it in spring, summer, fall, and in some cases in winter, and how much it costs for us to manage it in most cases. So it gives you an idea of a lot of these guys don't realize there's a lot of different species out there, and they do different things at different times. So if you key in on what they're doing at certain times, you might find a pattern that other guys would miss thinking it's all just grass.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because they definitely use different aquatic vegetation at different times of the year, and they definitely position themselves in that grass at different stages of the year. So that's good to know. That's a great resource.
That website's TVA.com/aquatic plants. These guys can also just Google TVA aquatic plants and get there. Not only does it show you what species, but it also shows where we manage. So a lot of people have always wondered, where is TVA actually doing their management? So we have every reservoir that we do management on and what those sites are. So you can see where they are, and we also post the dates that we're planning to go out there a week in advance. So guys can see when we're going to be treating an area. If you don't want to be around and hear an airboat, then you can avoid it, or if you're going to be one of the guys that takes my advice and fishes it the week after, you can see that at that website.
Can you tell us all the lakes on the Tennessee River Valley? Because I had no idea there were so many. You always think of...
How long do you have to give?
I had no idea. I always thought of the Tennessee River being Guntersville, Chickamauga, Kentucky Lake, but I had no idea that there were so many lakes involved in this whole valley.
Got 49, and the big ones you just mentioned. I forgot to add Wheeler and Wilson to that list. So I know you smaller fishermen are spending some time on Wilson, and Wheeler's a great lake as well. I mentioned Pickwick, of course, Nickajack, Chickamauga, Watts Bar, Melton Hill, you name it, Fort Loudon, a lot of those reservoirs. Cherokee is actually
Douglas Lake as well, right?
Yeah.
I had no idea. I just fished the open on Douglas Lake last week. Had no idea that was a part of the Tennessee River. I had no idea. It's amazing. It's a huge. You're responsible for a lot of acreage out there, a lot of ponds. I had no idea. That's a pretty amazing fact.
I spent a lot of time on the water, and I'm not going to complain a bit, except maybe in mid-August.
Oh yeah. None of them are in a good climate in August. I don't think.
No.
Not a single one of them. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Brett, I appreciate your time, man. Thanks for spending time with us. You guys make sure you check the description box for all the links to the websites that he talked about, and make sure you educate yourself on what guys actually do out here with aquatic vegetation. It's very important to our fisheries and our tournaments, and we got to have it. We need these guys to keep our fisheries healthy, and they're a big part of it.